Hello, everyone. This is Mike Wilkerson. I'm the founder of Stormwall Advisors, the host of Stormwall.com, and the author of Why America Matters. This is the April edition of the Stormwall Advisors monthly update. Here today to talk to you about an article I just wrote called Is America's Minsky Moment Approaching? If you're watching this on YouTube, please don't forget to give it a like and a share, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and also check me out on Twitter at MW_Stormwall. What I want to talk about today is a theme that I've been on for a while, which is, are we on the cusp of a financial crisis? I've been talking about it from the banking sector, but talking about it from where we are with inflation and otherwise. And this article and this talk and the issues that I'm bringing up here really bring it all together into one place. And so I'm going to explore the question, are we in the middle of a speculative bubble? Are the policies that the government has in place today actually making the situation much worse? And where might we be headed? All right, everyone. So why don't we go ahead and jump into this? I'm going to share my screen and we'll kick this off. So as I mentioned, wrote an article called America's Minsky Moment Approaches. And what I was trying to get at here, and let me just move some things around, uh, is the potential for a looming financial crisis. Now, this message struck a chord with a lot of Americans worried about the consequences of out of control government spending and inflation, et cetera. And I believe it had around 100,000 total reach across Zero Hedge, Twitter, the Epic Times, et cetera, and a lot of substantive comments as people could really resonate with what we were talking about. So just what is a Minsky moment? It was named after an American economist and professor, Hyman Minsky. It describes a financial markets crisis, especially in credit markets, caused by a sudden and systemic collapse in asset prices. And it usually comes after a sustained long-term period of speculative investment, excessive borrowing, and widespread financial risk-taking. In other words, it's the moment when the music stops playing, investors stop buying, and the Ponzi game ends abruptly. It is a hard crash. And he describes kind of three phases of lending and borrowing: uh, hedge, speculative, and Ponzi. And hedge is when people borrow, but they do so conservatively out of their own revenues and cash flows, have the ability to pay it off. As a period of prosperity continues, they take on more and more risk. They move into the speculative phase. And eventually, this leads to what he calls the Ponzi phase of the cycle, which is as over-indebted, over-levered borrowers and investors have too much debt. They can't repay it from their own cash flow. They're forced to sell assets to repay loans, even though those higher quality positions are actually good value. They have to be liquidated, and this creates a domino effect as asset values and market spiral lower, ultimately leading to a liquidity crunch, and a demand for cash. In particular, this Minsky moment that I described in the US has to do with the US government credit bubble that I argue will inevitably burst. So the US government has been running deficits since 2001 and raising debt to support it. We'll come back to this, but over 22 trillion of debt over the past 2 decades. There is no chance at this stage of repayment except through the hidden tax of high inflation. Government won't or isn't able to do what's required, which is to balance its budget, reduce debt through asset sales and revenue, end the entitlements regime, but rather will be forced to keep printing more and more money to roll that debt and fund the deficits to placate constituents. So the result, whether in the banks, debt markets, or otherwise, is a liquidity crisis that the government will, just as it's done in times past, meet with a fire hose of cash, leading to massive inflation. So these deficits that I mentioned, 22.5 trillion cumulatively since 2001, these are all funded by government debt. The point of a deficit is you don't have revenues to fund your expenses. You run a deficit, you raise debt to do that. And we have in the past 4 years during the COVID period, 2 years, 6 trillion of additional debt, and then we've been putting on about 1.5 trillion for the past 3 years. This year, we're halfway through the fiscal year, we're up 15% compared with last year. So this isn't getting better. We're putting on more and more debt, and this is unsustainable. So perpetual U.S. federal deficits is not something that we can continue on. We're now running the highest levels of debt as a percent of GDP, of the gross domestic product, in this past post-global financial crisis period that we've seen since World War II. The difference with that time period was the American economy was growing very rapidly, very productive. You had massive growth and productivity improvements coming out of the years after World War II. We're not in a similar issue today. In fact, the growth in debt is growing much more quickly than is the growth in gross domestic product. Since 2020, debt has been rapidly accelerating. We're putting on trillions of dollars each year. GDP is growing, but albeit not as much, and now debt is way outpacing the growth in GDP. We're now in a place where the U.S. is the fourth most indebted nation in the world, with 129% of GDP, debt to GDP. So only places like Japan, Italy, etc., have more debt than we do. And at some point, this becomes a problem. And in fact, as interest rates have gone up over the past 3 years now, the growth in the cost of the debt service has grown by double-digit amounts, quarter on quarter. So far this year, the last quarter, we saw debt was up. The interest cost on the debt was up by 4.5%, but 18.3%. That was quarter on quarter, 18.3% year over year. This is unsustainable. So we're now spending over $1 trillion annualized just to service the debt. And at the same time, inflation is not abating. So we're seeing just in February, headline inflation up 3.2%, core, excluding food and energy, up 3.8%. So nowhere near the inflation targets of 2% that the Fed has set for itself. And by the way, under the Biden administration, headline CPI is up 20%. And even if you exclude the more volatile food and energy sectors, all prices are up by 18%. So this is the impact that American consumers and households are feeling and facing. At the same time, we're seeing all-time highs across numerous asset categories. Stock market with the S&P 500 hitting an all-time high, Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies hitting new highs, housing market still at an all-time high, and gold now coming back to an all-time high, and both Bitcoin and gold have been outpacing even the S&P 500 in recent periods. So the question is, how long will this last, and when does that bubble pop? Well, as long as the markets continue to expect interest rate reductions and persistent inflation, this could continue for a while. What will pop it would be a systemic shock, something that creates a moment, sort of that cataclysmic moment where the music stops playing. And you can see that actually, in spite of interest rates being increased multiple times over the past 3 years, financial conditions are still very accommodative. So conditions, including credit, risk, leverage, all of these things, it's actually, even with 5% interest rates, financial conditions have eased pretty substantially over the past 2 years. And if you look at the long-term historical trend, financial conditions, in spite of 5% interest rates, which in recent years seem shockingly high, this is nothing compared with a long-term average. And we are still in a period of relatively loose financial conditions, implying that this sort of speculative bubble, speculative mania can continue for quite a while. Now, I've been arguing for a while that the idea that we can all just work this out, that we can end inflation, slowly deflate the bubble without causing a recession or a massive spike in unemployment, has been completely unrealistic. I wrote a couple of months ago an article entitled "A Soft Landing is a Fairy Tale," and I've done a similar program such as this on that topic. My concern here is that we have now hit the blow up phase of the market's exuberance, where sort of this parabolic rise, and we are nearing, if not at the top, where the Minsky moment pops this bubble, and the ride down from here is very steep and very severe. We're seeing this rapid increase in asset values over the last few months, as in that slope is getting very, very steep, and implying that we're at the end. Are we? I have no idea, but we're certainly getting closer. And of course, you can never really predict when this is going to happen. I want to wrap it up here and keep this short. I wanted to make just the key points and key takeaways for this, which is that I believe that we may be approaching our Minsky moment in financial markets. The markets are in what I believe is a desperate and parabolic rise near the end of a long speculative run. That in regard to the government, we are now in this, what I've called in times past, the doom loop of government deficit, debt, and inflation, where inflation keeps growing, deficits keep growing and continuing. The government raises more and more debt. unsustainable levels. Inflation is created as a result, and we are in this doom loop death spiral here. Without both a massive reduction in government spending and a productivity miracle, this is not going to end well. And unfortunately, while we do see some productivity bright spots, including developments in AI, in a lot of areas, government policy itself is pushing out innovation, pushing out productivity. We see it in the pressure on the crypto industry. We see it in the pressure on oil and gas industry, regulatory pressure, pushing a lot of activities offshore, making it impossible for entrepreneurs and investors to compete in this bureaucratic mass of red tape. Point three, when the music stops, which it inevitably will, the US government will be forced to monetize its debt. Well, what does that mean? It means instead of finding buyers for this ever-increasing pile of debt in the market from market investors, it will have to use the Federal Reserve to borrow from the Federal Reserve rather than sell to market or borrow from market investors. And the consequence of that is the Fed has to basically push this out, and inflation will run from there. Because the US government's only choices are to default on its debt, which it will not do in the case of the US government, raise taxes, which it cannot do as a practical matter, there is only one path left, and that is to let inflation run persistent and high as a way to print its way out of this crisis, to debase its debt. And as a result, the money supply will expand, as we've talked about, through a liquidity injection into the banks, which in the absence of productivity growth, if there's more money chasing fewer goods or fewer useful purposes, the price of everything goes up. And that's part of what we're seeing over the last 3 years. Finally, the US will enter a period of fiscal dominance when the Federal Reserve will be politicized. The government will suppress interest rates to keep its own debt affordable to itself. This will cause inflation to skyrocket when the cost of money can't find its natural level through to price controls, artificial suppression on that interest rate. What will happen is inflation will begin to move much more rapidly and grow out of control. The conclusion of all of this is, from an investment perspective, hard assets are the only safe haven for corporates who have the ability to continue to push on inflation to the customers. There is a way out through price increases, but this is a losing game ultimately, and becomes more and more difficult over time. For any investor, whether institutional or individual, hard assets in this environment are the best option. That's why we're seeing gold. That's why we're seeing oil and other commodities, Bitcoin, real estate. These inflation-resistant commodities and equities perform quite well in this environment, because I think the market, consciously or subconsciously, is aware that these issues are happening. So I'll go ahead and close it out now. If you want to learn more, you can check out stormwalladvisors.com. You can also follow me and all of my writings and all the articles, all the things I'm talking about, at stormwall.com. And we continue to talk about this issue as we go forward. I hope you found this helpful. It's a very serious moment in our history. This is not something that I enjoy talking about in a way, because it's not a hopeful message, but it's an important one that we need to understand, we need to hear, and we need to become more aware of. Over the past 3 years, spent a lot of time talking about the inflation issue, a lot of time talking about what we're seeing in this environment with Biden administration, government policies, how it's affecting all of these issues, depletion of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve as a means of price control. All of these things are interlinked and interrelated. I'm going to keep talking about it, and it's important to get the word out. So I hope you've enjoyed it. Again, don't forget to give it a like and a share if you're watching on YouTube, and we look forward to talking to you next time.